He called me obsolete in front of the entire board. Said I was of legacy architecture in a cloud-native world. Said the future didn't have room for compliance dinosaurs. What he forgot was simple. I built the infrastructure he was standing on. And when you mock the foundation, you'd better pray it never cracks. My name is Caroline Hayes, and for 12 years I was the Director of Regulatory Compliance at Aether Dynamics, one of Seattle's fastest-growing enterprise software companies. My job wasn't glamorous. No keynote speeches. No magazine covers. No TED Talks about disruption. My job was making sure we didn't end up indicted. The boardroom smelled like leather polish and ambition the morning it happened. 42nd floor. Floor-to-ceiling glass. The skyline stretched behind our CEO like a kingdom he believed he owned. At the head of the table sat Richard Drake. To his right, his son, Mason Drake. 34. MBA from Wharton. 2 years at a venture capital firm. 0 years surviving a federal audit. Before we begin, Richard said, steepling his fingers, we need to discuss structural evolution. Structural evolution. In corporate language, that means someone is about to be sacrificed. Mason leaned forward, voice smooth, rehearsed. We're entering a new era. AI-driven risk modeling. Automated compliance engines. Blockchain audit trails. What we can't carry into that future is operational drag. His eyes locked on mine. Some of our legacy frameworks, he continued, are too procedural. Too cautious. They were built for a different decade. Procedural. Cautious. Those procedures had saved Aether from 3-sec inquiries and a $52 million penalty 2 years earlier when a subcontractor misreported federal contract data. But sure. Cautious. Richard smiled at me with executive sympathy. Caroline, your contributions have been extraordinary. Truly. But Mason is going to spearhead a strategic compliance transformation initiative. You'll assist during the transition. Assist. Not lead. Not architect. Assist. I'd love to review the transformation plan, I said evenly. Compliance is not modular. You can't replace load-bearing beams with buzzwords. Mason's smile sharpened. That's exactly the mindset we're moving beyond. We don't need a museum of worst-case scenarios. We need agility. Agility. The favorite word of men who have never been subpoenaed. By the end of that meeting, my role had been renamed Legacy Systems Advisor. Within 48 hours, my executive dashboard access was downgraded. Within a week, my parking space disappeared. My direct reports were instructed to copy Mason on everything. It was surgical. Polite. Clean. But what they didn't understand was this. Compliance isn't a department. It's an ecosystem. Every approval chain. Every validation checkpoint. Every audit trail. Interlocked. Interdependent. Remove one piece and nothing collapses immediately. It just starts to drift. And drift is dangerous. What Mason didn't know was that 8 months earlier, after a near-miss acquisition had almost triggered a Department of Justice review, I updated our merger governance protocol. Buried in Section 18, Subsection D, 46 pages into a 70-page integration manual no one read. The clause was simple. If the designated integration officer changed within 10 business days of final regulatory submission, all compliance liability transferred fully and personally to the successor. No indemnification. No corporate shield. I didn't write it for Mason. I wrote it to prevent scapegoating. I wrote it because I'd seen executives quietly shift blame onto subordinates when mergers went sideways. Accountability, once diffused, disappears. I made sure this time it couldn't. The board approved it unanimously. Legal loved it. No one paid attention to the implications. Fast forward 3 weeks after my demotion. An email hit my inbox at 11:12 p.m. Project Atlas. Confidential. I wasn't supposed to see it, but someone forgot to remove me from a distribution group. Aether Dynamics was finalizing a $1.1 billion merger with a cybersecurity firm in Austin. Closing target: 6 weeks. And Mason Drake was named integration officer. I sat back in my home office and let the realization settle. He had no idea what he'd inherited. He'd stripped out redundancy checks, collapsed multi-tier approvals into single-click AI confirmations, replaced human audit review with machine summaries. He thought he'd optimized risk. He'd removed friction. But friction is what keeps wheels from spinning off the axle. Over the next 10 days, I did exactly what they asked. I documented everything. 382 pages. Clear indexing. Risk maps. Dependency matrices. I highlighted Section 18D in bold. Critical accountability provision. Requires strategic review. Mason skimmed it for less than a minute. I know because I embedded a tracking pixel. It fired once. 32 seconds. He never opened the full integration protocol. My last day ended quietly. Badge surrendered. Laptop wiped. 12 years reduced to a cardboard box and a cactus I somehow kept alive longer than most executives keep humility. 6 weeks later, my phone rang at 6:38 p.m. Mason. Caroline, he said, and for the first time, his voice didn't sound polished. We're experiencing integration anomalies. Anomalies. Vendor payments duplicating. Customer data mismatches. SEC preclearance flags. Orion systems weren't aligning with ours because the redundant validation bridges had been dismantled. The exact ones he'd called outdated. We may need you to consult, he added quickly. Temporary. Advisory. And my role? I asked. You'd report to me. I remain integration officer. Of course he did. Because if he stepped down, if he transferred the role within that 10-day window before final filing, Section 18D would trigger. And liability would follow him like a shadow. I'll pass, I said gently. But Mason, you might want to reread Section 18. Carefully. 3 days later, federal regulators requested supplementary documentation. Then forensic review. Then emergency board meetings. Stock volatility followed. Investors began asking hard questions. And then it happened. At 2:14 a.m. Pacific Time, Mason attempted to resign as integration officer, citing strategic misalignment. Legal blocked the change. Too late. The 10-day window had begun. His attempted resignation triggered automated compliance review. The system I built executed exactly as designed. Liability transfer locked. Irrevocable. By morning, the merger was suspended. By afternoon, the SEC announced formal investigation. By evening, Mason Drake was personally exposed to hundreds of millions in civil liability. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't hack a system. I didn't delete a line of code. I simply built a framework that assigned consequences where decisions were made. He called me legacy architecture. Turns out legacy architecture is what keeps the building standing. And when you rip it out without understanding how the weight distributes, the collapse isn't dramatic. It's mathematical. This wasn't revenge. It was documentation. It was gravity. It was cause and effect written in legal language and executed by a system too boring for innovation slides. But this was only the beginning. Because when the board realized what Section 18D actually meant, when they understood that the system had not malfunctioned but functioned perfectly, that was when the real panic began. The panic didn't start with shouting. It started with silence. The kind of silence that settles over a boardroom when powerful people realize the rules they ignored are now enforcing themselves. By the time the emergency meeting was called, the damage wasn't theoretical. It was documented. Logged. Time-stamped. At 2:14 a.m., the compliance system registered a trigger event. At 2:17 a.m., Section 18D executed. At 2:18 a.m., liability ownership reassigned to Mason Drake, Integration Officer of Record. No override available. No rollback permitted. No human discretion required. The board learned about it at 8:42 a.m. when the automated alert hit legal, external counsel, and the chairman simultaneously. I wasn't in that room, but I didn't need to be. Jennifer still worked there. She texted me 2 words. It triggered. I replied with one. I know. By mid-morning, federal regulators had formally escalated their review. The SEC had flagged inconsistencies in integration reporting. Vendor payment irregularities were now under investigation. Orion's legal team had frozen joint operations. The stock was down 12% before lunch. Mason's name appeared in 3 internal memos and 1 external inquiry. And that was before the forensic auditors arrived. At 6:05 p.m., Mason called again. No pretense this time. No buzzwords. Just fear. Caroline, I didn't understand the exposure. Of course he didn't. He never read past the executive summary. I need to know if there's a way to reverse the trigger. There wasn't. The clause was board approved. The configuration was validated months earlier. The execution was automated by design. The system did exactly what it was supposed to do, I told him calmly. It prevents last-minute role changes from diffusing accountability. He exhaled slowly. They're saying this could reach 400 million. I let the numbers sit in the air between us. Numbers don't panic. People do. Over the next 72 hours, the unraveling accelerated. Auditors uncovered 17 documented decisions where Mason overrode validation checkpoints. Each override had been logged. Each justification preserved. Each risk acknowledgement stored in the system. The AI summaries he'd relied on were incomplete because he had removed the human escalation tiers that flagged anomalies. Payments had duplicated because cooling periods were eliminated. Customer data fields had misaligned because triple validation bridges were dismantled. Every optimization had a paper trail. And paper trails, in federal investigations, are oxygen. The board convened again. This time with outside counsel, crisis communications, and insurance carriers. The insurance carriers were blunt. Policies exclude willful negligence. The emails were clear. Delete the redundant check. Streamline approvals. Stop escalating edge cases. His words. His sign-offs. His authority. Section 18D didn't create liability. It clarified ownership. That distinction mattered more than Mason understood. 3 days later, Orion formally terminated the merger. The press release was surgical. Regulatory misrepresentation and systemic integration failures. Translation. You told us your compliance architecture was stable. It wasn't. Class action attorneys began circling before the market closed. That afternoon, I received a call from the board's independent investigator. They wanted a deposition. Not to accuse me. To understand the mechanism. I agreed on one condition. My attorney present. Full transcript. No informal conversations. If we were going to talk about architecture, we were going to respect structure. The deposition lasted 4 hours. They asked if I designed Section 18D as a trap. I explained, clearly and without heat, that I designed it as a safeguard. It existed before Mason took the role. It was approved before he led the integration. It was documented in the transition materials. It was highlighted. It was labeled requires strategic review. If someone assumed responsibility without reviewing risk, that was not a trap. That was a choice. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I described dependencies. I described audit triggers. I described why redundancy in compliance is not inefficiency. It is resilience. By the end, even the investigator nodded. The system had functioned flawlessly. 2 weeks later, the SEC announced formal civil charges tied to compliance misrepresentation and failure to maintain adequate internal controls. Mason was named specifically as the responsible integration officer. The number circulating in media briefings was staggering. $437 million in potential exposure, before penalties and settlements. Asset freezes followed. Travel restrictions. Depositions. The board suspended Richard Drake pending further inquiry after internal emails revealed he encouraged removal of bureaucratic obstacles. Words matter. In corporate law, metaphors become evidence. I watched it unfold from my home office, not with triumph, but with clarity. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about gravity. Remove structural beams and the load redistributes. If the structure collapses, it doesn't blame the engineer who warned you about weight. It follows physics. The strangest moment came when Janice called me late one evening. "We're rebuilding," she said. "Using your original framework." She sounded steadier than I expected. The board wants every validation checkpoint restored. Every escalation tier reinstated. They're calling it the Hayes standard internally. I smiled at that. Not because my name was attached. Because someone finally understood that operational excellence is not the opposite of innovation. It is what makes innovation survivable. A week later, the chairman sent me an email. Brief. Direct. An apology without performance. "We underestimated the foundation," he wrote. "That was our failure." I archived it. Not out of bitterness. Out of completion. Closure doesn't require conversation. It requires alignment between action and consequence. The sentencing phase came months later. Mason accepted a plea in the civil matter to reduce extended litigation exposure. Financially, it would take decades to recover. Professionally, the door had closed. Publicly, he framed himself as a visionary punished for moving too fast. But the record was clear. He did not fail because he moved forward. He failed because he dismissed the map while accelerating. People ask me if I felt satisfaction. The honest answer is complicated. I did not enjoy watching a career collapse. I did not celebrate asset freezes. What I felt was validation. 12 years of being called procedural, cautious, risk-averse. Suddenly rebranded as foresight. The same documentation that once board executives now protected employees from broader sanctions. The same redundancy that was labeled inefficient now preserved hundreds of jobs. Today, I consult with companies that want something stronger than a slide deck. They want infrastructure. They want accountability frameworks that function even when leadership changes. They want clauses that cannot be quietly rewritten when pressure mounts. And I tell them the same thing every time. Compliance is not the enemy of speed. It is the guardrail that keeps speed from becoming impact. If you're watching this and you've ever been dismissed as too operational, hear me clearly. Operational thinking is not small thinking. It is systems thinking. It is the discipline of asking, what happens if? It is the courage to document what others prefer to assume. And sometimes, it is the quiet decision to build something so resilient that even when you are removed, it continues to do the right thing. Mason Drake called me obsolete. He said the future had no room for legacy architecture. But when the pressure hit, when regulators knocked, when investors demanded clarity, it wasn't innovation that held. It was structure. It was documentation. It was the unglamorous work done long before anyone applauds. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever worked with a mason, or if you've ever been the Caroline in a room that underestimated you, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what your Section 18D looks like in your world. Hit like if you believe accountability should follow authority. And subscribe if you want more stories about strategy, consequence, and the power of building systems that outlast arrogance. Remember, document everything. Build foundations that don't need applause. And never let anyone convince you that operational excellence is a weakness. I'm Caroline Hayes. And sometimes, the quietest code writes the loudest ending.